In the summer of 1914, Europe expected a fast, decisive war. Generals promised sweeping maneuvers, brilliant cavalry charges, and heroic infantry advances, short, sharp battles that would end before the autumn leaves touched the ground. But within just 3 months, the dream of a quick victory collapsed. The open fields of Belgium and France, once filled with marching columns and artillery wagons, hardened into a static, unbreakable line of trenches stretching hundreds of kilometers. How did the war move from mobile battles to a frozen world of mud, wire, and exhaustion? The answer begins with 2 war plans, neither of which survived first contact with reality. Germany entered the First World War with a famous Schlieffen Plan. Its strategy was simple on paper: send the bulk of the German army sweeping through neutral Belgium, curve around Paris like an iron scythe, and crush the French army against its own border. Once France fell, Germany would turn east and defeat Russia, which they assumed would mobilize slowly. France, however, expected a very different war. Their Plan 17 focused not on defense, but on pure offense. French generals believed courage, speed, and determination, élan, would carry their army straight into Germany through the border regions of Alsace and Lorraine. They believed morale could overcome firepower. Both plans met catastrophe within weeks. The French launched their border offensives in August, only to be met with well-prepared German defenses. Instead of glorious breakthroughs, French units advanced into deadly fields swept by artillery and rifle fire. On August 22, 1914, still the deadliest day in French military history, over 20,000 French soldiers fell in a single day of fighting. Plan 17 was hemorrhaging lives faster than the French command could comprehend. Meanwhile, to the north, the German right wing smashed through Belgium and forced the British Expeditionary Force and French armies into retreat. What the French leadership had considered a secondary front suddenly became the main threat to Paris. The German army seemed unstoppable, pushing deeper into France every day. But then came the First Battle of the Marne. In early September, the Allies halted the German advance just before Paris. German commanders, stretched thin and exhausted, had no choice but to pull back. The Schlieffen Plan, like Plan 17, had collapsed. Once these initial war plans failed, the armies began a frantic period historians later called the Race to the Sea. Instead of maneuvering around each other successfully, both sides extended their lines northwards, trying to outflank the other. But each time one side dug in, the other matched it. What began as temporary defensive holes in the ground quickly became something far more permanent. By the end of October 1914, a nearly unbroken line of trenches stretched from the Swiss frontier to the North Sea. The mobile war was over. A new kind of warfare had begun. But why did both sides suddenly stop moving? Why didn't the armies simply attack and break through? The answer lies in the brutal technological revolution that had taken place before the war, one the generals had underestimated. Artillery had become the deadliest force on the battlefield. New quick-firing guns like a French 75mm cannon could fire 15 to 30 explosive shells per minute, far more than the older guns seen in past European wars. German heavy artillery could strike from even farther away, delivering devastating impacts that forced armies to seek cover deep underground. Rifles, too, had advanced. German Mausers, British Lee Enfields, and French Libelles could fire rapidly with incredible accuracy at long distances. Machine guns, such as the Maxim and Vickers, changed the rules of battle entirely, spitting hundreds of rounds per minute with terrifying reliability. An advancing soldier crossing an open field had almost no chance against these weapons. French and German officers had read about these developments. They had seen warnings in earlier conflicts like the Russo-Japanese War, but many believed courage could overcome firepower. In 1913, one French officer even claimed that scientific firepower would always yield to bravery. But in August and September 1914, the battlefield proved otherwise. Charles de Gaulle, then a young French officer, described one of the earliest shocks of modern warfare. advancing over open ground only to be pinned down instantly by accurate, overwhelming enemy fire. Courage meant little against artillery shells exploding without warning, or machine guns that could sweep fields in seconds. Casualties soared so rapidly that both armies realized they were approaching the brink of collapse. France alone lost over 265,000 dead in the first 5 months, more deaths than in any other year of the war. Germany lost tens of thousands too, and even the smaller British army suffered enormous early casualties. These losses were unsustainable. The only escape was downward into the earth. Soldiers discovered that trenches provided the one thing the new weapons could not easily destroy: protection. A man standing upright was a target. A man lying in a trench could survive artillery barrages that would otherwise wipe out entire companies. A French officer wrote that even the most accurate German shelling could not reach well-dug trenches. Deep dugouts protected men from indirect fire. Firing steps allowed riflemen to fight effectively while remaining shielded. By late 1914, trenches weren't temporary shelters. They were essential to survival. But the real reason trench warfare lasted so long was not simply the firepower. Armies struggled with communication, logistics, and coordination. Commanders could not control million-man armies spread over kilometers with outdated telephone lines and horse messengers. Artillery could not easily support advancing infantry across complex hidden trench networks. Ammunition shortages were common. Every attempt to break through failed. The trenches were no longer just protection, they were the war. The Western Front had frozen into a vast, jagged scar across Europe, a line of trenches, dugouts, barbed wire, machine gun nests, and artillery observation posts. But to understand why this system became nearly impossible to break, we have to look at the deeper problems that crippled every attempt at mobile warfare. It wasn't just the weapons, it was the way armies tried to use them, and the enormous structural weaknesses inside their own organizations. From the earliest battles, coordinating infantry and artillery proved almost impossible. Armies in 1914 were enormous, millions of men, but they still relied on slow, fragile methods of communication. A single artillery battery might be several kilometers behind the infantry line. If the infantry came under heavy fire or faced uncut wire, there was often no reliable way to request immediate artillery support. Field telephones required wires stretched across the ground, and those wires were constantly torn apart by shell fire. Radios were primitive and could not transmit voice messages. Runners, soldiers carrying written notes, were frequently killed or lost. Cavalry messengers struggled to cross broken terrain. The result was chaos. French Captain Alphonse Grasset described watching his company suffer under brutal German fire while desperately waiting for artillery support that never arrived. Men lay wounded and dead across an open field, crying out for help as German bullets tore through them. Grasset wrote bitterly about the absence of guns that should have been only kilometers away. This wasn't an isolated incident, it was the norm. Add to this the terrifying lethality of machine guns and rifles, and an infantry assault across open ground became almost suicidal. Even when small groups of soldiers did manage to break into enemy trenches, the advance usually stalled. They could go forward, but reinforcements could not reach them. Artillery could not be moved up fast enough. Ammunition ran low. The men were isolated and eventually pushed back by a counterattack. On the other side of the equation, the defenders enjoyed enormous advantages. They operated on interior lines and used their railway networks efficiently. A German unit under pressure could be reinforced from another sector within hours. Meanwhile, the attackers, exhausted, hungry, and lacking ammunition, were several days away from their own railheads. In simple terms, the defender could move faster, supply faster, and shoot faster. The attacker could not. This is why trench warfare became inevitable. But the problem ran even deeper. Armies had outgrown the ability of their generals to control them. French commander Joffre discovered that many senior officers lacked training to handle modern, fast-moving armies. Thousands of generals had learned their craft in colonial wars, small, maneuverable conflicts, not industrial warfare, with millions of men. Joffre fired nearly 40% of his generals in late 1914. Germany faced similar problems. Units advanced so rapidly into Belgium and France that commanders lost track of their own divisions. The German 1st and 2nd Armies drifted apart, weakening the entire right wing and contributing to the failure of the Schlieffen Plan. Even worse was the lack of reliable intelligence. At Mons, British commander Horace Smith-Dorrien had no idea that the French army on his right had been forced back nearly 9 miles. His corps was left holding an exposed salient simply because nobody had been able to deliver the information on time. The communications network of 1914 was simply not designed for modern war. While communications collapsed, logistics suffered even more. Armies depended on horses, and horses could not keep up with the insane pace of the Schlieffen Plan. German infantry marched 30 to 40 kilometers per day with 26-kilogram packs. Thousands of soldiers collapsed from exhaustion or dehydration. Some took their own lives under the strain. Heavy artillery, a crucial part of modern warfare, fell far behind. Without it, German infantry could not destroy French and British positions, further slowing the advance. And then came the railway problem. Every kilometer the Germans advanced took them further away from their own supply lines. Railways in Belgium and France had different gauges and layouts. Captured railways needed time to repair, reconfigure, and secure. Until then, German armies were limited to what headquarter wagons and horses could deliver, a fraction of what they needed. Meanwhile, the French moved reinforcements rapidly along their railway network, bringing fresh troops to the Marne just in time to stop the German advance. The attackers' mobility was collapsing. The defenders' mobility was increasing. This imbalance alone made deep breakthroughs nearly impossible. Artillery added another layer of difficulty. Both the French and Germans burned through their pre-war shell stockpiles far faster than expected. French factories could only produce 10,000 shells per day, completely inadequate for 3,500 artillery pieces. Joffre was forced to ration shells, limiting each gun to a tiny number per day. German pre-war stocks, meant to last 6 months, were nearly gone within 6 weeks. Without artillery support, infantry assaults were destined to fail. And with every failure, both sides dug deeper, expanding their trenches, strengthening bunkers, and laying more wire. By November 1914, the trenches were so deep, complex, and continuous that they formed a vast underground fortress stretching across the continent. The men in those trenches experienced a world unlike anything soldiers had seen before. German soldier Paul Hube described the exhausting routine of digging, repairing, and reinforcing trenches under constant shelling. He wrote that it felt endless, an inescapable nightmare. British soldiers in Flanders described water rising to their knees, bodies buried under parapets, and constant fear of snipers. A British officer wrote in November that he was awfully bored by the trenches and wished for the order to advance. That order would come, but not for years. Millions would share that same frustration, that same exhaustion, that same question, when will this end? But trench warfare was not deliberate. It was the only option left. As one historian put it, the armies of Europe had built vast machines they could barely control. Once mobile warfare broke down, they were trapped in their own creation. The trenches were born out of necessity, out of exhaustion, out of fear, out of survival, and breaking out of them would take 3 more years, millions more shells, and new weapons the world had never seen.
By late 1914, the Western Front had transformed from a battlefield of movement into a vast fortified world of mud, wire, and misery. What began as temporary fieldworks hardened into an immense defensive system. Deep trenches, reinforced dugouts, concrete machine gun posts, observation bunkers, artillery shelters, and barbed wire fields stretching hundreds of meters. This was not a battlefield anymore. It was a fortress without walls. And once these systems matured, breaking them became almost impossible. Commanders on both sides convinced themselves that the next big offensive might succeed if they simply attacked harder, faster, with more guns or more men. But every attempt ran into the same wall of reality. Firepower in 1914 to 1917 overwhelmingly favored the defender. Even the simplest assault required soldiers to climb out of their trenches, advance across open ground littered with craters and wire, and survive a storm of shells, bullets, and machine gun fire. The attacking infantry could rarely reach the enemy trench before being cut down. If they did, they often discovered the next line of trenches only a few hundred meters behind the first, each line supported by artillery zeroed in on every approach. It was a system designed to swallow offensives whole. The trench networks eventually grew so dense that they created an underground landscape. Some sectors had multiple lines of trenches: front line, support line, reserve line, connected by communication trenches, all protected by wire and covered by overlapping machine guns. Caverns and dugouts protected thousands of troops from artillery, allowing defenders to survive bombardments that would have wiped out entire armies in earlier wars. The scale alone made these lines nearly impossible to crack. Even when breakthroughs did happen, they could not be exploited. Cavalry could not advance through mud and craters. Artillery could not move up fast enough to support the infantry. Communications failed. Reinforcements could not reach the forward units in time. The attacker inevitably lost momentum, while the defender, using intact railways, rushed fresh divisions to seal the gap. This was the fatal equation of trench warfare. Gains were tiny, losses were enormous, and no breakthrough could be sustained. As months turned to years, the trenches became symbols of the industrialized hell that Europe had built for itself. Soldiers lived through rain and snow, lice and rats, fear and hunger. Bodies were buried in parapets. Shells churned the earth until it resembled the surface of another planet. Yet commanders continued to seek solutions. New technologies appeared: creeping barrages, stormtrooper tactics, tanks, poison gas, improved communications. But it would take years before these innovations matured enough to finally break the deadlock. By the time trench warfare ended in 1918, millions had died in the same narrow strip of land that had barely moved since the fall of 1914. And the great irony remained: none of the armies had intended to fight this kind of war. Trench warfare was not chosen, it happened, born from firepower, mobility shortfalls, flawed command systems, and the collapse of every pre-war plan. What emerged was a grim stalemate unlike anything the world had ever seen. A British soldier summed it up best when he wrote in his diary, "We wait for an order to advance, but the trenches never end." The world would spend the next 4 years trying to solve that riddle, and the cost would change history forever.